All right, so we have our CSA all mixed. We're going to now add that to our tub. This is where I need my squeegees. I'm going to use the smaller one, and this is going to help me remove all the material from the bucket. This is mostly for efficiency. No sense in wasting this material. Plus, it helps when it comes time to clean up the bucket. And here's where, if you have the opportunity of some volunteers to help you, you can have them do any of this, but obviously mixing out the bucket or cleaning up the bucket shortly after its use is helpful. Don't let the squeegee go too far, you'll use it again. All right, now at this point, what we're going to do is really just work the cement into the jute. We want to get it submerged. We want to get the full length of the jute into our cement puddle here. And what we're doing is kind of just coating it at this point. We're just trying to make sure everything's coated. Now, if all of the material is on one end, you can literally rotate it around and make sure that all pieces of your jute are covered. Now, if you remember, we folded this jute in half and then half again. So we have roughly a 1 foot width of jute, and we want to try to maintain that for the most part. We don't want to try to open it up in here or significantly disturb the layout of these fibers, because they easily move. We want to try to minimize the disturbance, but we also want to make sure we agitate this so that we're not only making sure all of the strands of fiber or strands of the jute are being coated, but that the actual fibers within each strand are getting some of that CSA material worked in between the strands. I always think about the natural fibers like rebar in a concrete building, and so you're trying to work your cement, your CSA, all around that surface. Now, one of the things you're looking for as you're doing this is, number one, to make sure it's coated, but I'm going to make an example here where if it's not fully coated, you're going to see a bit of a reddish tint. I don't know how well you can see that, but a reddish tint. That's also a sign, number one, it's not coated, but also that your mix may be too dry. So we don't want that to happen. We want to make sure that it's fully coated. Now I've done this by rolling it up sometimes. So you're rolling basically right back up again. And that kind of works nicely because this material goes and settles down through. And you can unroll it again, but ultimately, just before you go to lay it out on the table, you're going to want to make sure that it's not rolled up, because that rolling tends to squirt some of the cement out and you don't get as good a coating. So the final stage that I usually have in here is I'll turn it into kind of an S pattern, so I know that pretty much everything is coated. And you always check the ends. For some reason the ends tend to sometimes avoid getting good coverage. And again, what you're looking for is any sort of a reddish tint. Something that's like a mahogany color or a dark brownish red, because that's usually a sign that your jute is not well coated. All right, so it's, maybe a minute and a half or so of mixing or agitating, I suppose. Then what we're going to take is one end, and we're going to lay this out so that one end is down near the starting point, and we're going to lay it roughly down the center. Now you notice there's actually still quite a bit of CSA in here, or cement, But we're going to put that off to the side for a little bit. The first thing you're going to do, if you remember, we folded this in a way that we now need to unfold it. So we have to find the ends. So there's one edge. There's another edge. But before we open that up, what we want to do is find the hinge. So we know here's two edges and here's our hinge. And so before we open it up completely, we're going to take our hinge and lay that right down the center of our table. So here's our hinge. And once we have that hinge laid out down the center, now we can take and flip the sides apart. Okay, now at this point, we don't need our clips anymore. We can take them out. Wind's not going to blow that away. And this is the point at which you want to try and lay this jute impregnated cement on the table. Now, we want to make sure that we have this edge lined up with the outer edge of that board that's underneath, but when we pull it in this direction, we want to make sure we're pulling the warp lines, not just a weft line, because you pull the weft line, it'll come right off. So grab a decent amount of material, pull it down where you need to, and you're just going to get everything laid out on the table as best you can. Now, if these edges have a lot of strands that are close together, you can pull those apart a little bit, and the cooler the temperature, the more you can, let's just say, diddle with this. But this is your opportunity to try to lay things out as flat as you can. And what we want to do, we know we had 4 feet of width of our material to start with, so we're going to try to stretch back to our 4-foot width. We know that the table is 4 feet wide, and so that's what we're doing. So we're going for 4 feet wide on either side. And then what I'm going to do is pull on this end to the point that it just gets to the other end. I don't want to pull the other end away from that edge, but I do want to stretch these fibers as far as I can, and you'll see those warp lines start to be, pretty much parallel or perfectly aligned now with the table or the run of the fabric. All right, so we might go through the edges one more time. Now this is also a point, you see there's some gaps here in the CSA because the fibers are moving around. And what we can do is try to push those fibers so we minimize the size of the gaps. Sometimes you'll see some fibers that are closer together. We can push them around a little bit. And again, you don't need to, it doesn't have to be perfect, but these provide some strengthening opportunities and just a little bit more uniformity. All right, so now that we think we're pretty well laid out, we're going to bring our form in. And we're going to place our form at this front edge. The width of our form is 4 feet. The width of our table is 4 feet. The width of the plywood is 4 feet. Everything is good. And now what we're going to do is not have this quite all the way to the edge. It's hard to see from that angle, but we're going to put the prism with maybe 1 inch or 2 of material hanging over the side or beyond the edge. And then we're going to take and we're going to pinch the plywood underneath against the form so that our jute is kind of squeezed in between. And so we now can just roll this. If you have 2 people, you can have somebody on either end. You're going to go 1 roll, but don't let go yet because then it'll just slough off. So continue to pinch this together. Pinch again, rotate, and now the jute is on 2 sides and it won't fall off. You can take this piece of plywood, hide it under this end because we'll need it again up here. Take our fabric, or excuse me, our plastic, and lay it back down again. And at this point, you're going to want to push the prism back up towards the front of the table. That helps to tighten everything up. And then lift the prism and tuck in that little bit of extra fabric that was hanging over when we first placed the prism on the end of the table. What that does is help to hold on to it when we get into our next roll. So you're going to tuck that in. You're also going to want to make sure that the edge of the fabric, the jute that's on the prism, is lining up with the edge of the fabric that's on the table, and you can pull it at this point to get that lined up a little better. I'm going to do the same thing on this side. Make sure we're tucking that little bit of extra fabric underneath the prism. It helps to hold it when we go to our next rotation. And then here, you can see we need a little bit more pull. Here's the edge of our inner form, and so we want to make sure that that jute is all the way to that edge, and we can pull up to it and even adjust the placement of the jute on the table too. And we see that this jute's going to be a little short, but we can work that out. Okay, so now we've got our first roll as one layer now. We're going to roll again. Take that plastic down, roll again, roll again. And now you notice we wouldn't be able to roll another time, but we now have 2 layers of jute here. So the first thing we're going to do is take our larger squeegee and sweep or scrape this material off. It's kind of helpful if we have a bucket to support this, or if you have another set of hands, because otherwise it's a little bit sloppy. This is where our larger squeegee comes in handy, but we can pretty much pull all of this residual CSA down to this lower piece of plastic. Fold that back a little if we have excess. And then we're just going to drag this material into our tub. And again, this is helping us be a little more resource efficient, but also it helps with the cleanup of these pieces of plastic. These squeegees are just simply squeegee for window washing, so nothing fancy. All right, now we're going to go ahead and put our clamps back on. Typically you wouldn't need to do this, but it's a bit breezy today. So now we have a tub with quite a bit of material left in it, and if you are going to be setting up your prism with a solid bottom, this is what you want to use it for. Now we're going to rotate this back, but before we do that, we're going to take a little bit of this material and we're going to lay it right along that outer edge, and we're going to pull the underlaying jute and the upper laying jute, kind of seal that together and make sure it lines up with the outside of our prism. So that's our 4-foot width that we're trying to establish at that point. So we're kind of gluing those 2 layers together, make sure there's a really good seal there, and adding just a little bit of extra cement. So again, you're taking just a kind of a small handful, you're laying it along that edge, you're pulling these 2 layers so that they're the same length, and then you're pulling those layers so that they meet the 4-foot kind of width. It's helpful because when it comes to measuring things out or stacking them, it's nice to have consistency. So again, just a little bit of material. We're going to lay that up on that edge, kind of get it in between, and then pull that so that it's the right length. Okay, so now we have our 2 sides here with extra jute. And we're going to now roll it back 1 turn. Okay. Now, we have our piece of plywood that we snuck up here just temporarily, and we're going to slide that underneath all the way up until it hits the prism form. Okay, so now that piece of plywood is right here, right tight to the edge. And we're going to take our excess material. So the edge of that plywood comes here. We're going to take this excess material and push it up so that the underlying jute, or this jute layer here, is no longer than the edge of that piece of plywood. And then you can kind of spread this out a little bit. Then we're going to take our tub of residual CSA and we're just going to dump it right on that space. We're going to take a shorter squeegee, clean this up as best we can. And then we're going to spread this liquid CSA throughout this layer, and this will again become the bottom of the prism. And what we found is that by having a solid bottom, it tends to get stuck to the substrate, kind of get almost like a suction cup on the substrate where it's placed, and is less likely to move around. Now, if this was not going to be on the bottom, or you wanted to have a fully pervious situation on all sides, you would not want to have added this layer. And then you would want to adjust your mix a little bit so you didn't have this excess material. All right, so we've distributed that evenly, and now what we're going to do is rotate our prism so that it falls right on top of that layer. And at this point now, you're going to want to make sure that the prism is adjusted slightly so that it's right on top of that piece of plywood that's underneath. So I can feel the plywood, and I'm lining everything up. This side looks good. One last adjustment perhaps. This side, same thing. We have to scoot it over a little bit. One last adjustment for the length. Okay, so that's all ready. Now what we've got is a layer of our plastic on the inside, which is really important for moisture management. We're now going to take this plastic that we've been rolling things up on and lay it up against our prism. Then take this piece of plastic and pull it over. So now what we've got is our JRCSA material, the jute with the cement, sandwiched or rolled around the form, but now sandwiched between two layers of this plastic. And that piece of plywood underneath can help us at this point pick this up and relocate it if we want to use this as a workbench for another prism or for whatever reason. But if you're not going to move it, or after you've moved it, you want to lift up and tuck that residual bit of plastic underneath, because that helps to seal this material. So I tend to give one quick wipe over the whole surface on both sides, just so that the layers, the two layers of the jute material are going to stick together. It just helps a little more confidence in that. Now you notice this is a little bit open. We could seal this shut. Generally I haven't done that in the past. But at this point now, it's just a matter of waiting for this to cure. Now if you were to push on it right now, there's a lot of flex to it. But once this starts to harden, and it's really temperature dependent, at 80 degrees, this will be 20 minutes. Basically, you'll feel significant resistance. And then within 30 minutes, it will have set. At this temperature, it's about 55 or so degrees. It might take more like an hour before we get that resistance. Once we get to the resistance, we can actually pull our inner form out, but we're going to leave our plastic layers. We're going to leave this outer plastic layer, and also we're going to leave this inner plastic layer. So what we'll do is we can recover our form and reuse it, but our plastic is going to still stay sandwiched on either side of the JRCSA, and that's to maintain and capture moisture. As the CSA reacts, it's hydrating, and so it needs that moisture to fully cure and strengthen. And so we'll want to leave that plastic on at least, say, 6 hours, and generally I'll do it for overnight, so 12 hours. And then you can take the plastic off and it's pretty much ready. You could deploy it at that point, or you can let it continue to cure. It's about a full week before it's fully cured. But either way, that's it. This one would be ready to basically just sit for another half hour to an hour, pull the form out, and then you could run that form through again. And then the outer piece here could be basically plastic stripped off tomorrow at some point.